As the Imperium of Man entered the 36th millennium, the state church of the Adeptus Minsitorum reached the height of its political control over the galaxy. But this influence had been achieved by unleashing bloody religious wars that killed billions and usurping the rightful rule of the High Lords of Terra. The Minsitorum increasingly took credit for the successes actually earned by the Space Marines, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and other Imperial organizations. The adepts of the Adeptus Administratum in particular were incensed by the loss of their primary role in governing the Emperor's realm. As the new millennium dawned, the Administratum had grown weary of the constant bureaucratic shadow wars. Instead, with the appointment of Goge Vandire as the 361st Master of the Administratum, that Adepta prepared to openly seize power from the Ecclesiarchy. During his rise to power, Vandire had proven to be a vicious political infighter within the complex bureaucracy of the Administratum. He had not hesitated to use assassins to remove his rivals. He was also a staunch opponent of the Minsitorum's political dominance over the Imperium in the wake of the Cataclysm of Souls. Immediately after his appointment as the Master of the Administratum, he sought to extend his influence over the state church by gaining the support of various cardinals of the Holy Synod. He sought to ensure the election as the next ecclesiarch of the man later known to history as Paulus III. As a cardinal, Paulus III was considered a degenerate incompetent and someone who could be easily manipulated into serving the interests of the Administratum. However, to the surprise of the cardinals, Vandire moved more aggressively than expected. Rather than seek to rule through his puppet, Paulus III was removed from the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra after his election by a hand-picked contingent of Astra Militarum officers. In what was nothing less than a de facto coup d'etat, they declared him a traitor to humanity on questionable charges and shot him to death. Before the full synod could react, Vandire had his supporters among the cardinals declare him the new ecclesiarch. As both the master of the Administratum and the ecclesiarch, Vandire was now the most powerful person in the Imperium. To cement his power, he raised a host of new cardinals to the synod who were wholly dependent on his patronage for their ascent. Those cardinals who opposed Vandire's election sought to flee to the ecclesiarchy's secondary capital on Ophelia 7 to escape the new dictator's clutches. But fate thwarted their efforts when their vessel was consumed by a massive warp storm while in transit, and none of them were ever seen again. Vandire claimed that their disappearance had been the will of the Emperor, and proved that his rule had been divinely ordained. Vandire proved to be as ruthless in power as he had been effective at gaining it. He often dictated long speeches that bemoaned the current state of the Imperium, and outlined brutal actions to be taken against the current cross-section of humanity that he blamed for all its ills. The Astra Militarum and Imperial Navy's hierarchy was riddled with officers willing to execute any of Vandire's orders. Rapid promotion was ensured, as long as they never asked too many questions about the nature of their victims' supposed heresy. But despite his iron-fisted control of both the Imperial Church and its secular bureaucracy, Vandire was extremely paranoid and saw plots and intrigue against his rule in every corner. He often fell into a trance-like state, during which he would argue with himself, sometimes mumbling, sometimes shouting out loud. When questioned, he claimed he was receiving messages from the Emperor. But in every case, these periods were always followed by bouts of violent repression. Vandire had installed a massive holographic map of the galaxy in his audience chamber, which provided a constant update of warp storm activity. Whenever the warp routes proved clear, he would dispatch an Imperial fleet to impose his direct rule on a new world he believed sought to betray him. In the course of Vandire's constant search for sedition, the existence of a cult that called itself the Daughters of the Emperor came to his attention. The group was comprised of 500 women located on the obscure agri-world of San Lior. They devoted themselves to the worship of the god Emperor through the study of the ancient martial disciplines in an attempt to purify their mind of all worldly considerations. Vandire at first feared their existence as another threat to his rule. Yet with their martial skill and mental purity, they would make the perfect guards and companions. If they could be convinced to serve him directly, they might make him feel more secure and remove some of his rampant paranoia. To carry out his plan, Vandire announced that he was going to honor San Lior with an ecclesiarchal visit. Vandire arrived on that distant world, accompanied by an entourage of nearly 100,000 servants and soldiers. The kilometers-long procession made its way to the temple of the Daughters of the Emperor, but once it arrived, Vandire discovered its doors barred against him. The High Lord was informed by a young member of the sect that they did not recognize his authority as the rightful ecclesiarch. Vandire's functionaries expected an explosion of rage and indignation, but he remained calm, as he had expected such an insolent response. Instead, he explained that if he was allowed within their sanctum, the women would witness a miraculous feat that proved he was the chosen of the god Emperor. Before the assembled warrior women, Vandire knelt in supplication to the Emperor while clutching the ecclesiarchal rosarius in his hands. Then he stood and ordered one of his troopers to shoot him with a laser pistol. As the bolt of energy struck Vandire, there was an explosion of light, which blinded all who stood within the hall. When they were able to look once more, Vandire stood totally unharmed in the center of the chamber, leaning on his bone walking cane. Almost as one, the Imperial guardsmen and the Daughters of the Emperor fell to their knees in awe of the apparent miracle that had protected the Emperor's favored son. But of course, as Vandire would later boast to his long-suffering scribes, it was all an illusion. The High Lord had gambled that the isolated Daughters of the Emperor had never heard of a rosarius or the personal shield generator it contained. The Daughters of the Emperor swore their fealty then and there to Vandire. They returned to Terra with him as the new ecclesiarchal bodyguard. From then on, the women warriors, renamed the Brides of the Emperor by Vandire, were his personal retinue of protectors and companions. They were trained by the Astra Militarum and given the best Imperial weapons and technology. They were Vandire's constant guardians and even his executioners, willing to kill without question for the man they believed to be the Emperor's hand in the material realm. When several dissident cardinals finally got up the courage to try and assassinate Vandire a few years later, the brides walked into the council chamber, locked the doors, and emerged hours later with the severed heads of every cardinal present. Now more secure in his power, Vandire's tyranny only grew, the repressive campaigns driven by his paranoia resulting in the purge of billions of lives. But when the yoke of repression seemed to be heaviest, a new hope arose on the far-off world of Dimamar. Dimamar had once been home to a religious sect called the Confederation of Light. It had been the primary rival of the ancient Temple of the Savior Emperor for the religious faith of the Imperium. Though the Confederation also worshipped the Emperor as a god, it believed his sacrifice for the good of humanity should be emulated by every believer. It preached that the faithful of the god Emperor should live humbly, forgoing the pursuit of all secular power. A believer should instead pursue generosity and compassion with every word and deed. This message directly contradicted the Temple of the Savior Emperor's call for theocracy, and so the early Adeptus Minsitorum had launched its first war of faith against the Confederation. With the backing of the High Lords of Terra the Temple had succeeded in eliminating the rival sect as an alternate foundation for the imperial state religion. But now reports reached Vandire that the ancient rites of the Confederation were being practiced on Dimamar once more. Its message spread across many nearby worlds by a humble priest named Sebastian Thor. None on Terra knew where this man came from or what his ultimate purpose might be. But Vandire sensed he was a political threat to the Ecclesiarchy, and he ordered the most trusted and loyal of the Frateris Templars to deal with the threat. He commanded the Ecclesiarchy's army to raise Dimamar and eradicate every living creature on the world. The fleet was sent, but shortly after it jumped into the warp outside of the Clax system, it was smashed apart by the sudden emergence of a massive new warp storm. Believed to have been divine intervention by the Emperor himself, this warp storm showed no sign of quickly dissipating and became known as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath. The destruction of this fleet badly weakened the military forces of the Ecclesiarchy. In response, the whole of the Segmentum Obscurus, the imperial province centered on the galactic north, exploded in rebellion. Most of the rebels took up the message of Sebastian Thor and the Confederation of Light, which began to make a pilgrimage from world to world. Everywhere he went, Thor called for a reform of the Adeptus Minsitorum and declared Vandire to be the true heretic to the Emperor's faith. News of Thor's message gradually spread from the Segmentum Obscurus to the rest of the galaxy. Distance exaggerated the stories, and soon Thor was being hailed as an avenging angel. Throughout most of Vandire's rule, the Adeptus Astartes and Adeptus Mechanicus had largely ignored what was happening in the rest of the galaxy to focus on their own affairs. But once the Segmentum Obscurus erupted in rebellion, they moved against Vandire. Many of the chapter masters of Space Marine chapters located in the region near Terra began voicing their support for Sebastian Thor's proposed reforms. At the same time, the Adeptus Mechanicus issued a summons for the High Lords to indict and execute Vandire as a traitor to the Omnissiah. To remove Vandire from power, the Fabricator General ordered regiments of the Martian Skitarii to Terra. They were joined by forces from the Imperial Fists, Firehawks, Soul Drinkers, and Black Templars chapters. Over several months, they reduced the outer sections of the ecclesiarchal palace to rubble, but the brides of the Emperor ensured that the central complex of the palace remained impervious to any assault. But the true threat to Vandire's rule would come from within. The Adeptus Custodes, the bodyguards and ancient companions of the Emperor, had not openly set foot outside the Imperial Palace in the years following the heresy. Most of the custodians blamed themselves for what had befallen the Emperor, and vowed that no further harm would ever come to the master of mankind. They largely avoided the politics of the Imperium, preferring instead to focus solely on their protective duties. But as the Imperium seemed on the brink of civil war once more, they chose to act. A small contingent of custodians made their way through secret tunnels connecting the Imperial Palace to the Ecclesiarchal Palace, where Vandire had holed up with the brides of the Emperor in the face of assault by the Mechanicus and the Space Marines. Though they tried to convince the brides that they were serving the true traitor to the Emperor, none would listen. So the commander of the custodians made the only choice he could. He left his men behind as hostages, and guided the leader of the brides and her bodyguard of 5 female warriors back into the tunnels. Eventually, with the custodian's guidance, they passed through the ultimate gate and stood before the golden throne itself. It is unknown what transpired when they were brought before the wounded form of the Emperor, his shattered body held forever frozen by the psychic energies of the throne. But when they stepped out of the ultimate gate once more, their eyes burned with rage and hatred. The leader of the brides, Alicia Dominica, returned to the ecclesiarchal palace. She explained to her sisters that Vandire was a traitor to the emperor, who had corrupted the ecclesiarchy into a vehicle for his own ambition. Even worse, he had perverted their own order to his evil designs. Without further discussion, Dominica entered Vandire's chambers, where she declared him a heretic who had turned his back on the emperor and almost destroyed everything the master of mankind sought to build. Declaring that there could be no mercy for such a crime, Dominica drew her power sword. Vandire looked up in terrified confusion and could only sputter, "I don't have time to die. I'm too busy." Then the blade descended, decapitating him in one stroke and cutting even his protective Rosarius in two. Vandire's reign of blood was finally over. With Vandire dead, Sebastian Thor was brought to Terra. Following the testimony of the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, both Thor and his Confederation of Light were cleared of all charges of heresy for their part in the rebellion. With the backing of the Astartes and the Mechanicus, Thor was elected to replace Vandire as the ecclesiarch. He immediately began the reformation of the Adeptus Minsitorum he had promised. The state church's theology was recast to focus on the promotion of only spiritual values, ending the Temple of the Savior Emperor's attempts to establish a theocracy. To ensure this remained the case, Thor established a new church council known as the Synod Ministra on Ophelia 7. It acted as a secondary governing body for the Minsitorum that was intended to relay and disseminate the diktats of the Ecclesiarch and Holy Synod on Terra to the rest of the galaxy. The Synod Ministra would be the actual enforcer of ecclesiarchy law, even against its own hierarchy. This division of power would protect the Church from ever again being manipulated by outside organizations, or even an individual within its own structure. At the same time, each of the galaxy's dioceses were broken down into smaller areas. This decreased each cardinal's personal power since they controlled smaller populations and fewer resources. The increase in the number of cardinals also meant the Holy Synod would be larger and more fractious, diluting the power held by any single individual. One of the High Lord's first acts after the end of the Reign of Blood was to issue the Decree Passive, which declared that the ecclesiarchy would no longer be allowed to maintain a force of men under arms. This resulted in the effective abolition of the Frateris Templar, which had been responsible for so many of Vandire's abuses. Yet Sebastian Thor was a canny enough politician to know that the ecclesiarchy should not be completely subservient to the will of the other imperial organizations. As such, he chose to interpret the Decree Passive literally and transform the brides of the emperor, with not a single man among their ranks, into the ecclesiarchy's standing military. Renamed the Orders Militant of the Adepta Sororitas, the High Lords were uneasy with this development, but could find no flaw in Thor's legal logic. Many also found persuasive his argument that the Adepta Sororitas would themselves rein in the Minsitorum's power when necessary. What the public didn't know was that the Inquisition had also created a third major ordo, the Ordo Hereticus, in the wake of the Reign of Blood. The new ordo was given the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, as its chamber militant, its military arm. The Inquisition had learned the hard way that not all threats to the Imperium came from without. Sometimes, the worst enemies were those within the Imperium's own organizations. It would be the job of the Ordo Hereticus and the Adepta Sororitas to ensure that no more Goge Vandires arose to threaten the Emperor's vision for humanity. With the ecclesiarchy reformed, the Space Marine chapter masters and the Fabricator General of the Mechanicus resurrected the Senatorum Imperialis and established a new body of High Lords to govern the Imperium. Many Imperial officials guilty of collusion with Vandire were tried for their actions, and most of the Imperium's different Adepta were encouraged to purge their own ranks. New planetary governors were promoted from the ranks of those who had opposed Vandire. In time, the Imperium recovered from this latest trauma. Having disposed of the enemy within, its citizens turned outward, eager to expand the domain of the God Emperor once more.